Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Christine Garver-Apgar. I am a research associate at the Behavioral Health and Wellness Program, and I'm joined today by my colleague and our research director at BHWP, Susan Young, who will be presenting during the second half of today's webinar. This is a two-part series with today's webinar focusing on pathways by which adversity and trauma experienced during early childhood can have lifelong impacts on health and wellness, both for the children who experience the adversity themselves, but also for future generations. Today, we will be talking broadly about early adversity and how it impacts the development of chronic disease, cognition, emotion, and behavior. And then next month, we will focus more specifically on how early adversity influences nicotine addiction and attempts to quit using tobacco. So why is early childhood adversity an important topic? Why are we here today talking about this? I'm going to read a recent policy statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics. They said, protecting young children from adversity is a promising science-based strategy to address many of the most persistent and costly problems facing contemporary society, including limited educational achievement, diminished economic productivity, criminality, and disparities in health. This policy statement, I think, reflects really well the paradigm shift in the medical community's approach to health and disease, which has been taking place over the last couple of decades. Researchers and practitioners are beginning to recognize that a truly diverse array of health problems, including chronic disease, mental illness, addiction, cognitive challenges, and socio-emotional difficulties can all be thought of as having their roots in early childhood development. And just to bring this point home with a few statistics, the recent National Comorbidity Survey highlighted that childhood adverse experiences explain nearly 32% of all psychiatric disorders, and an even higher percentage, about 44%, of those with childhood onset. Various forms of early adversity are thought to account for about 67% of the population attributable risk for suicide. So on that dismal note, let me just go through the objectives for today's presentation. I'm going to spend the first half of today getting us oriented around the topic of early adversity and reviewing some key findings from the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. I'll also talk about how stress physiology plays a role in some of the negative consequences of adversity, and we'll talk about what those consequences are. And then I'll distinguish between acute, chronic, and toxic stress. Sure. And then I will turn the presentation over to Susan just a bit later for a discussion of the challenges associated with research in the field of early childhood adversity and a discussion of the pathways by which early adversity impacts health and wellness across generations. So how are we transmitting these problems across generations over time? So first, I'll give a brief synopsis of a really landmark study of over 17,000 adults that influenced both the shift in pediatric practice I mentioned above and also much of the research in this area which followed. When the Adverse Childhood Experiences study was published in 1998, psychologists and sociologists and medical investigators had really only begun to examine long-term impacts of child abuse. And typically at this time they were studying childhood sexual abuse and looking at how that impacts adolescent health and also adult mental health. But up until this study, folks really hadn't examined associations between childhood abuse and medical problems, things like chronic disease, nor had they examined other sources of childhood adversity that are likely to co-occur with various forms of childhood abuse. So things like parental substance abuse and domestic violence and criminal activity. And without measuring these other types of adversity, negative outcomes couldn't really be attributed solely to one single type of childhood trauma. And effects of cumulative exposure to multiple forms of adversity weren't really being assessed. So that's what the ACE study set out to do. It set out to examine the long-term impact of abuse and household dysfunction during childhood on several types of outcomes in adults. The study examined early childhood exposure to 7 forms of adversity. So 3 types of abuse, psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, and then 4 different indicators of household dysfunction. So this includes having somebody in the household with a substance abuse challenge, having somebody in the household with a mental illness, experiencing domestic violence, and somebody with criminal behavior in the household. And what the study found was, first of all, that ACEs, these kinds of exposures, occur regularly across all races, across all economic classes, and all geographic regions. Although there is a much higher percentage of ACEs for those folks living in poverty, for folks who are struggling financially. More than half of all respondents reported experiencing at least one of these categories of childhood adversity, and over a quarter reported having at least 2 different categories of experiences. So as the number of childhood exposures to adversity increased, and by number of exposures, I mean how many different types of categories did a person experience, not just how many episodes of a particular type of adversity, but criminal activity and having a parent with a mental illness, for example, would be 2 different categories of exposure. Compared to people who had no exposures to the adverse events examined in the study, people who had experienced 4 or more of these types of adversity were more likely to have several behavioral health conditions and risk factors, including over 4 times the risk of experiencing depression, over 12 times the risk of attempting suicide sometime in their lives. They were triple the times more likely to report having 50 or more sexual partners, and consequently they were over twice as likely to have been diagnosed with a sexually transmitted disease. They were also more likely to suffer from addictions. They were twice as likely to smoke or use tobacco. They were over 7 times more likely to report alcoholism, almost 5 times more likely to use illicit drugs, and more than 10 times likely to inject illegal drugs. And then given the increased likelihood of engaging in risky health behaviors or of suffering behavioral health conditions, it's not surprising that they were also more likely to suffer chronic diseases and other medical problems. So they have, almost double the risk of being severely obese, and consequently having double the likelihood of developing heart disease and cancer and suffering a stroke. They were 4 times more likely to develop chronic bronchitis and almost twice as likely to develop diabetes. Since the original ACE study was published in 1998, researchers have expanded the types of early adversity that are considered both salient and also predictive of future negative life outcomes. One area of adversity that was adopted into the construct really early on was childhood neglect, both physical and emotional. Early studies of neglect or deprivation had examined impacts on children who were being raised in institutional settings, where there was often no parental attachment figure who was both sensitive and responsive to the needs of children. These experiences were often linked to poor social skill development and impaired emotion regulation. Also, the experience of parental separation and divorce was added to the typical measures of childhood adversity, although I should note that there was rarely, if ever, any consideration of sort of how hostile or the divorce or the split was, or the level of distress in the household as a function of divorce or separation. And as we know, that can vary quite widely. As this line of research expanded, 3 indicators of socioeconomic adversity were added to the construct, and they included poverty, food insecurity, and homelessness or housing insecurity. And it's also been recognized that victimization, whether it comes from peers in the form of bullying or social rejection, or more broadly from being victimized through a violent crime, are forms of adversity that should be included in the construct. And finally, the death of a parent or a sibling was also examined as a potential indicator, but interestingly, some studies have shown that this type of trauma is only weakly correlated with most other indicators of adversity, and it's less predictive of future psychopathology, as it turns out. So we can think of 3 primary domains of outcomes that are influenced by exposure to significant adversity during early childhood development and that have consequences across the lifespan. The first of these domains is cognitive. So this is a broad area ranging from learning and memory to higher cognitive functioning, such as reasoning and planning. The second domain we will review is emotional. That is, how does adversity interfere with the normal development of emotional awareness, emotional responding, and emotional regulation early in life and throughout adulthood? And the third domain is physical. So that is, how does early chronic adversity and stress directly impact immune function and metabolic systems, which can increase the future risks of chronic diseases, things like cardiovascular disease and cancer and diabetes. And for today's presentation, we are going to focus more on the first 2 areas, cognitive and emotional impacts, and slightly less on the physical impacts, although there is a very substantial body of literature on direct physical impacts of early stress. As I'm sure you realize, these pathways or these systems do not function independently. They're interdependent in many ways, and for that reason, an imbalance in one system can trigger an altered developmental trajectory in another. Understanding how childhood adversity can lead to lifelong health impacts is really ultimately a story about stress. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the biology of stress. So first of all, what is it? What do we mean by stress? Well, first of all, stress is not something that happens to you. It's your body's response to what happens to you. A stressor can be defined as an unpredictable or an uncontrollable event that challenges an organism's ability to maintain self-regulation or to achieve key biological goals. So things like survival and reproduction. We often think of stress as being negative, but in fact, stressors can be either positive or negative. So opportunities in the environment, such as a mating opportunity, activate a stress response just as much as an environmental threat, such as a predator. So as we see here on the left, this peahen is presenting this peacock with an environmental opportunity to which he needs to adaptively respond by altering his physiology or his psychology, or probably both. And it looks like he's doing a fine job of that. And then on the right, of course, we have a much more negative environmental threat or type of challenge for this bird. I couldn't find another peacock picture, but it's still a bird that is experiencing a more negative stressor in the environment, something that we would more typically associate with stress. So to cope with stressors, organisms have to respond adaptively to these environmental challenges in some way. And these responses are orchestrated by a system called the stress response system. So the stress response system is made up primarily of 3 integrated parts. The parasympathetic system promotes rest and restorative behavior in the absence of stress, or in response to a very mild stressor, the PNS promotes focused attention. So for example, if you're trying to solve a difficult puzzle, when a more challenging stressor is encountered, the PNS responds simply by withdrawing this inhibitory influence, which is also called the vagal withdrawal. And this allows the other parts of the stress response system to respond. So if withdrawing the PNS response is not sufficient to deal with a stressor, then a second layer is the sympathetic system. This is the system that promotes the very standard flight or fight response with which we're all familiar. This is when epinephrine and norepinephrine are secreted to increase heart rate and respiration and blood supply to the skeletal muscles, and glucose is released into the bloodstream. This is the quintessential running from a lion, or if you're the bird in the last slide, running from a wolf. The HPA axis is the third component. The HPA axis mounts a more delayed or long-term response to environmental challenges, particularly psychosocial challenges. The endpoint of the HPA response is the release of cortisol by the adrenal cortex, cortisol in humans or other glucocorticoids in other species, typically within 5 minutes after the triggering event, and cortisol often peaks between about 10 and 30 minutes. So glucose is released to the bloodstream, alertness and vigilance increase, and memory is sensitized. So situations involving unpredictability or not being in control, and those that involve some aspect of social evaluation are the quickest ways to elicit an HPA response. So, for example, giving a speech. So not only is there an element of not being in control of the situation, you can't predict how you're going to do or how your audience is going to respond, but there's also an important element of social evaluation happening. So you know you are being evaluated by the audience. Giving a speech is a laboratory way of eliciting the HPA response, and lots of research on humans. Each of these types of responses are adaptive solutions to problems encountered by humans over evolutionary history, but just because they are adaptive responses doesn't mean that they don't come with physiological costs. And we're going to talk about some of these costs later in this presentation. Stress is often characterized as being one of two types, acute or chronic. Acute stress involve short-lived responses to episodic or discrete events. They have a clearly defined beginning and ending. And after acute stress is experienced, physiological responses typically return to baseline. So as an example, this would be preparing for an exam, or getting a vaccination at the doctor's office, or dealing perhaps just a single time with a bully, or perhaps a negligent caregiver, or maybe even a single episode of physical trauma. Chronic stress involves more prolonged responses to environmental threats or challenges that seem to go on indefinitely. It involves long-term activation of the stress response system. So these can be things like significant discrimination or poverty or homelessness, or dealing with an abusive or a mentally ill parent. Both types of stress can be either mild, moderate, or severe, and both types of stress induce a physiological response of the stress response system. But experts believe that chronic stress, which is often psychosocial in nature and results in sustained cortisol release, carries more long-term consequences for physical and mental health than does most forms of acute stress. And you may think of PTSD after experiencing an intense episodic trauma, but in this case, although the precipitating event might have been acute, ongoing mental anguish from the trauma itself can be thought of as a chronic stressor that goes on indefinitely. The types of childhood adversity studied in the ACE study are the types of chronic psychosocial stressors that result in sustained activation of the HPA system and an altered pattern of cortisol release, and that has consequences for how the architecture of the brain develops during childhood. Okay, toxic stress is a term that you will often hear used to describe the costly physiological responses to early childhood adversity. The term was coined by folks working at the Center on the Developing Child, which is a group of researchers and policy advocates out of Harvard. When the term originally started being used, it had a slightly more narrow definition: the physiologic responses to chronic adversity in the absence of stable, nurturing, responsive caregivers. So when children have the buffering influence of at least one positive, responsive caregiver, they can be resilient in the face of all kinds of adverse circumstances. But when children are dealing with chronic adversity, things like poverty or other stressful circumstances that go on indefinitely and that often involve the child's closest family members, and they do not have a secure caregiver to help them regulate that stress response, it's much, much more difficult for young children to be resilient in the face of those challenges and to experience healthy development. Now, I should note here that I have mixed feelings about the term toxic stress, because I think it implies that the stress response to adversity is somehow pathological, when in fact it's an adaptive response. Humans, of course, like all species, have a very long evolutionary history of exposure to adversity. And the stress response system is functionally designed to allow individuals to respond to threats and challenges in the most effective way possible. So you could say that toxic stress really represents the physiological costs associated with the body's attempt to make the best of a bad situation. But some chronic adversity does result in a developmental trajectory that has really important negative consequences. And I want to emphasize here that just because we acknowledge that stress responses are adaptive rather than pathological, that should in no way diminish the profound sense of urgency that we as a society should have to address and prevent these negative consequences associated with early childhood adversity. Okay, so how is it that we go from experiencing early adversity or child neglect to heart disease or depression or addiction or difficulty making plans for the future or problems delaying gratification or even perhaps having trouble as adults with our relationships? What are the pathways that lead from one to the other? It's an extremely complicated question, and of course, we can't even begin to fully answer it in the time that we have today. But we do want to introduce you to some of the latest scientific understandings of how early stress becomes deeply embedded into a child's physiology and neurobiology. In studies of both neglected children and those who experienced early life in an institution, researchers have demonstrated associations between cognitive deficits and very specific alterations to neurophysiology within particular brain regions. So the deficits we're talking about include lower IQ, reduced language skills, memory and learning problems, reduced attention and executive function abilities, and reduced psychomotor development. So for example, the amount of gray matter is correlated with IQ, and studies of those experiencing early adversity find reduced levels of gray matter and overall cortical volume in addition to reduced IQ. As another example, both human and non-human studies now have found associations between reduced corpus callosum volume and exposure to early life adversity. The corpus callosum is involved with integrating cognitive, motor, and sensory processes across the two brain hemispheres. So it's really important. It assists with vigilance and planning, as well as with language and associative memory functions. And finally, the prefrontal cortex is particularly susceptible to prolonged stress and HPA activation, partly because of the large numbers of cortisol receptors in this area, but also because of the long period of development that the prefrontal cortex goes through. The corpus callosum is similar. Development goes on long into the third decade of life. The development of executive functions coincide with maturation of the prefrontal cortex. Executive functions include inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility, and sustained attention. And so deficits in these areas manifest as impulse control difficulties and problems with delayed gratification, planning and decision-making, and attentional difficulties. Deficits to executive functions are some of the most frequently reported impairments following early life adversity. One really important caveat to this body of research that I want to mention is that unfortunately most studies of cognitive function in abused or neglected children fail to account for heritable differences. So it may be that parents who abuse or neglect their children may themselves have reduced cognitive function and associated neurophysiological alterations. And some of those characteristics might be heritable, which could at least partially account for these associations. So in other words, it may not be that the early life adversity is causing the cognitive deficits, but rather those kiddos are more likely to inherit genetic vulnerabilities or predisposition to cognitive difficulties, and that might partly account for some of these associations. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but it's a big gap in this literature, and it's something that Susan will talk about a little bit more later on in this presentation. When children are removed from institutionalized or abusive settings, they often experience a catch-up in their cognitive function, which is really very encouraging. This may be because many of the brain regions involved in these deficits, as I mentioned, are still developing well into the third decade of life. So they're really quite malleable for a long period of time, and that allows for a more positive environments to reverse some of the cognitive impairments. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about impacts on affective functioning and emotion. The ability to evaluate and learn from rewarding outcomes is very important for adaptive and goal-directed decision-making. A body of research from both animals and humans now suggests that robust brain reward function is a key component of resiliency following trauma. Blunted responses to cues that would normally activate that reward pathway may increase the risk for mood disorders, and they may also lead to compensatory reward-seeking behaviors, so things like substance abuse. This is particularly true of nicotine, so we'll talk more about this next time. A fairly large body of research now also shows that maltreated and abused children actually perceive emotions differently than their non-maltreated peers. So they devote increased attentional resources to angry and fearful facial expressions, but not to faces depicting other emotions. And they also require less visual information to detect anger in faces. So if you show these kiddos a picture that has been degraded, kids who have been maltreated are better at detecting anger in those pictures. So in other words, maltreated children are actually better at detecting, and they're more sensitive to the facial expressions that would have indicated a potential threatening situation. And consistent with these findings, maltreated children have increased gray matter volume in a brain region that is associated specifically with nonverbal processing and emotion perception. Abused kiddos also have a harder time disengaging from threat-related cues, but I think this body of research sort of speaks more to considering the adaptive functions of some of these stress responses as being there for a reason, even if they have really undesirable and unhealthy consequences. Also, children exposed to severe early life adversity experience significant emotion regulation difficulties, which are thought to confer risks for later psychopathology. And finally, a very large body of literature has documented increased risk for depression and anxiety, bipolar disorder, and other affective disorders in people who experience early childhood adversity. Unlike cognitive deficits, altered affective functions seem less malleable to repair and more resistant to change, even after children are removed from the stressful environment. This may be because a brain region called the amygdala is quite pivotal in learning and responding to social and emotional stimuli in a child's environment. The amygdala develops very early. So, for example, its development is really complete in females, at least by age 4. So it has a really early sensitive period where it would be vulnerable to disruption. And so these types of brain regions may be less malleable than some of the brain regions involved with cognitive function. And so prevention efforts may be particularly important for avoiding the sorts of long-term changes to affective functioning observed in children exposed to early adversity. And I'm going to now end there with my portion, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Susan Young, who will first discuss some challenges in ACE research.
So as you've just heard, we've made great progress in understanding the association between adverse childhood experiences and negative mental and physical health outcomes. However, scientists now recognize that there are a variety of challenges in the behavioral and in the neurobiological research that's being done that need to be addressed in order to move the field forward, as well as to increase the clinical utility of this research. And that's what I'm going to address now. One thing that's commonly discussed in the literature is the challenge of reaching consensus in how childhood adversity is actually defined for the purposes of research, but also the purposes of clinical evaluation of a child and his or her family. Recent studies on how we measure severity of adversity have been motivated in part by the premise that certain influential experiences have either been omitted from or at least overlooked in much of the ACEs research, and that other adversities are likely to be particularly salient in certain population subgroups or in particular contexts or even particular cultures. One approach to understanding the interrelationships among the commonly recognized ACEs has been to use statistical methods to help cluster these ACEs into meaningful subsets. These studies have yielded pretty variable results, but several have argued that there are at least 2 primary ACE subsets or factors. And as I show on the slide in the green bubbles, one school of thought is that ACEs can be better studied if we cluster experiences that directly impact the child, things like physical abuse, for example, and separately cluster experiences that are more focused on the family or the household, things like perhaps divorce or poverty. Other researchers argue that grouping these adverse experiences into clusters that are more representative of physiological systems that are impacted may be more useful. For example, as shown in the second set of green bubbles, we could cluster experiences that are more focused or that are more representative of threat to the child, things like physical abuse, and separately things that represent deprivation or things that are missing from the child's environment or development, things like a nurturing environment in their household. There are likely several other adversities that could be defined as ACEs, but one thing that we have to avoid or at least recognize is the potential confounding of cause and effect. And what I mean by that is that some constructs that have been proposed as potential ACEs are actually potential results of adversity. These are things such as obesity or poor school performance or achievement, which have been proposed in some studies as adversity. But this, as you can imagine, can kind of blur the lines between adversity and the consequences of adversity. And of course, all these issues are very difficult to tease apart when we all know that adversity begets more adversity. Another thing that needs to be addressed is whether the impact of adversity can be examined within sensitive developmental periods. It's somewhat surprising that so few studies have taken into account the timing of individual adverse life events when they assess the overall severity of ACEs. Of course, postnatally, childhood and adolescence are the developmental periods with the most rapid and complex changes in a person's physiology and psychology. Developmental research across a variety of disciplines has identified specific sensitive periods of development for the healthy cognitive and emotional growth. So it's not surprising that they're critical of research that ignores things like age of onset of particular adverse events or the duration of those events. For example, critical periods for early language development are well characterized, and abnormally low verbal stimulation of a child during this period can severely delay the normal acquisition of language skills. There are also known critical periods for the healthy development of, for example, emotion regulation, executive cognitive functioning, which you just heard about, things like peer bonding, sexual identity, as well as the recognition of an appropriate response to social cues. In most cases, these critical developmental periods map onto the timing of specific neurodevelopmental changes and maturation. Adversities that are experienced during sensitive periods of development likely cause an amplified and particularly damaging impact on children's growth. A better understanding of the timing and chronicity of adverse events experienced by an individual could lead us to a better understanding of the cumulative severity of risk, as well as perhaps the importance of the timing of particular interventions that may achieve the best chance of remediation of some of these problems. It's also been recognized that we may benefit from trying to distinguish between general and more specific risks associated with future psychopathology. Most early studies established a somewhat arbitrary cutoff for the number of adverse events necessary, sometimes 4 or a cutoff of 6, for the designation of severe or significant history of adversity. Other studies have focused on a single aspect of adversity, such as neglect, things like malnutrition or social isolation. Others have focused on just physical abuse or poverty. For example, research has demonstrated that a particular effect of deprivation, either through neglectful parenting or through institutionalization, on the development of anxiety and depression. So another challenge for ACEs research is a better understanding of whether certain ACEs represent a more general risk for a wide range of psychopathologies, or alternatively, whether specific types of adversities increase risk for specific conditions, such as developmental disorders or affective disorders or behavioral disorders. Also, as Christine mentioned a few minutes ago, most research in the area of adverse childhood experiences does not take into account the individual differences that may be operating. These are individual differences in things like stress perception, stress reactivity, coping skills, vulnerability, resilience, and even personality characteristics. I'll briefly talk about individual differences and how they may have a role in how we understand the impact of adversity on health outcomes through these 4 potential mechanisms: genetic transmission or family transmission, epigenetics, fetal programming, and the microbiome. Of course, it's not an exhaustive list of the mechanisms at work, but it does address some of the most commonly examined in the literature. So it's commonly recognized that adversity of many types runs in families or seems to be passed down from parents to their children. But it may not always be apparent that in addition to the social and the environmental transmission that occurs, that there are also genetic factors that are passed down. And these may explain, at least in part, the risks for poor health outcomes in the next generation. So it's problematic that, for example, studies of anxiety and depression in adults who've experienced significant adversity during their childhood rarely examine the incidence of anxiety or depression in their biological parents. But there have been decades of biometrical research on twins and adoptive families that have demonstrated that a significant portion of the risk for these internalizing disorders is genetic in origin. So it's likely that at least part of the association between early adversity and later psychopathology can be explained by genetic risk. And of course, that's not to say that the adversity isn't having a negative impact, but it may be particularly impactful for individuals with a family history of psychopathology. These effects could be more clearly disentangled if, for example, a study was designed to examine those associations separately for individuals with and individuals without a family history of the negative health outcome of interest. Another source of individual differences is epigenetics. This is a term that refers to the factors that change the structure and function of our DNA without actually changing our genetic code per se. These factors are generally considered to be environmental in nature, things like toxins and diet, normal aging, pharmaceuticals, including drugs of abuse. Other things like trauma and persistent stress can also have strong epigenetic effects. And this diagram illustrates the two primary epigenetic mechanisms that have been identified. The first is DNA methylation, and the second is histone modification. And we won't go into the molecular details of these two processes, but the key thing to understand is that the functional changes that these mechanisms induce are regulatory in nature. You can think of epigenetic effects as gas pedals and brakes. Some effects increase gene expression, which can either be helpful or benign or damaging, and other epigenetic effects can slow or stop gene expression, which can also be either helpful or have no effect or be very damaging. Though early research on epigenetics suggests that these effects could not be transmitted from generation to generation, we now know that they can impact our germ cells, specifically our sperm and egg cells, which does make them potentially heritable or effects that can be passed from parents to their children. Epigenetic influences have been identified for a range of disease outcomes, including psychiatric conditions such as schizophrenia and depression. More recent research in this area, primarily those using animal models of stress and deprivation, have demonstrated that there is plasticity in organisms, and there's great potential to repair at least some of the harmful epigenetic effects through things like enriched environments. There are also some hopeful findings in the human studies, suggesting that compensating for impoverished environments and removing children from abusive or neglectful rearing environments can reduce the negative impacts of adversity at both the molecular level and a physiological level, and could potentially provide at least some level of recovery. In modern pediatrics and developmental psychobiology, fetal programming, which is sometimes called prenatal programming, is the general idea that during development of the embryo and fetus, important physiological parameters can be altered or even reset by environmental events. And most importantly, this resetting can endure into adulthood and even affect the following generation. In studies of various disease outcomes, medical researchers have found that heart disease and diabetes were more common among people who were born with lower birth weights. These study findings suggest that deprivation prenatally due to poor nutrition or alcohol and drug abuse or other aspects of adversity like poverty excuse me, caused changes in the fetus and the way its organs developed. These changes later in life led to a higher risk of certain kinds of disease. Other studies have demonstrated that this idea can be applied to the effects of stress experienced by the pregnant woman. Stress leads to higher levels of a stress-related hormone, cortisol, which you've just heard about a few minutes ago, which may affect how the baby responds to stress as a child and as an adult, thereby creating additional challenges and problems. The essence of this idea is that impacts on the prenatal environments in the womb can change gene expression during the developmental construction of tissues and organs, including the brain, and these changes can result in long-range health consequences during childhood and also throughout adulthood. The human microbiome is one of the areas of medical research that's really exploding right now. And what it refers to is the collective genomes of an enormous community of microscopic organisms, things like bacteria and fungi and viruses, that inhabit the human body or one particular part of the body. Amazingly, we have about 10 times as many microbial cells than we do human cells. Thanks in part to the development of high-throughput genetics technology, scientists can now examine the location, the number, and even the variety of microorganisms in our bodies, and they can study the relationship between these factors and our health. For example, our gut microbiome plays an essential role in our immune system by protecting us against pathogens, metabolizing dietary nutrients and drugs, producing vitamins, and by influencing the absorption and distribution of dietary fat. However, the influence of the gut microbiome is known to extend beyond our gastrointestinal tract, with far-reaching effects on the brain by way of what is called the brain-gut microbiome axis, which is quite a mouthful. Basically, this axis is a bidirectional communication between our central nervous system and our gastrointestinal tract, which does involve neural pathways as well as things like immune and endocrine mechanisms. There's a rapidly growing line of research aimed at understanding both the influences on our microbiome, including things like stress, nutrition, as well as the health consequences of a damaged or imbalanced microbiome. So we want to finish the webinar by moving back to where we began. Why do we need to know about ACEs? How will this knowledge inform our work both in clinical practice as well as in advocacy and the policy work that we may be involved in? Well, there are a variety of ways that we can use this information in our day-to-day work with families and kids, and this list just represents a few of those. The research highlights the importance of attending to early screening and risk assessments in families because of the importance of the timing of these events, as well as the need for early interventions. Secondly, it suggests that the focus should be on family-level interventions because many of the adversities are not happening to a single individual within the family unit, but affecting the entire family. This approach is likely to produce the most lasting effects. It also calls for the need to engage the community in supportive activities. For things that are impacting the family unit, such as poverty or homelessness or perhaps crime, criminal activities in a particular neighborhood, community support can be recruited to be an active part of treatment or other interventions. There's also been a recent push to develop family-centered or patient-centered medical homes, where different individuals in the family can get both their medical health care as well as their behavioral or mental health care provided in a trusted, local, either a clinic or other center that provides health care close to the home. There's also been a push recently to include trauma-informed care training in a variety of educational programs. It's probably becoming pretty normative in programs such as social work and psychology training, and hopefully in the not too distant future it will also become fairly normative among physicians in training to work with kids and families. And finally, wraparound services, which basically refers to follow-up among providers and the ability of providers to communicate with one another about particular risk factors, experiences, as well as treatment planning, so that there can be a team approach to address the needs of not only the child, but the entire family unit. And so we thought we would end by providing a few key resources, although the list is very long and beyond the scope of this presentation. As Christine mentioned, there's a great body of research that is referenced at the Center for the Developing Child, and the website is listed there at Harvard University. There are vast resources for learning about early childhood mental health, about adverse childhood experiences, and about building resilience, among many other things. Our Health and Human Services Division of the federal government also has within it the Administration for Child and Families, and there are a variety of resources available there, including educational resources for addressing abuse and neglect issues in families. Another resource is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, again, which provides a variety of resources for clinicians and as well as for families and kids. And if those of you who are working closely in this arena, if you are interested in receiving additional information about resources that are useful for education and expanding your clinical services, please let us know. We can offer those to you. So we want to thank you for your participation and attention, and although we're very tight on time because of our technical difficulties, it would be great if we could offer just a few minutes for those of you that may have comments or want to share experiences or have questions about some element of the presentation.
And as you're asking questions, please feel free to use the group chat functionality, and we can read those questions out loud. Otherwise, you may be able to unmute yourself to ask a question. Okay, well, there may not be very many questions given that this went a little long. And so if you do have follow-up questions, please feel free to send those to our email address right here at bh.wellness@ucdenver.edu. And you can also find us on our website at www.bhwellness.org. We'll go ahead and end the webinar for today. Thank you so much, everybody, for your patience, and we hope you enjoyed today's webinar.